The desert sun blazed mercilessly over the town of Bitter Creek when they dragged Clara Cooper to the ancient cottonwood and bound her beneath the largest wasp nest in 3 counties, her wedding dress torn and mud-stained, her crime nothing more than saying no to the wrong man's proposal. But salvation would come from the most unexpected source, a lone Comanche warrior who had every reason to let the white settlers face the consequences of their own cruelty. The morning of September 15, 1847, would forever mark the day when human decency died in Bitter Creek, Arizona territory, and when one woman's refusal to be owned would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of a community built on prejudice and fear. Bitter Creek sprawled across the desert like a wound that refused to heal, its wooden buildings bleached gray by the relentless Arizona sun and scoured by winds that carried the whispers of ancient Apache warnings. The town had been carved from the wilderness by men who believed that might made right, and that anyone different from them was either a threat to be eliminated or property to be controlled. 347 souls called this place home, though the definition of souls remained a matter of heated debate depending on the color of one's skin or the shape of one's body. Main Street ran straight as a rifle barrel from the makeshift church at the east end to the saloon at the west, with the general store, blacksmith shop and doctor's office scattered between like afterthoughts. The buildings leaned against each other for support, much like their inhabitants leaned on shared prejudices to make sense of a world that seemed determined to challenge their narrow understanding of how things should be. Wooden sidewalks connected the establishments, elevated just enough to keep the decent folks' boots out of the horse manure and mud that perpetually coated the street. The cottonwood tree stood at the edge of town like a sentinel, its massive trunk scarred by decades of harsh weather and human cruelty. Generations of wasps had built their papery kingdoms in its branches, creating architectural marvels that most folks in Bitter Creek were too ignorant to appreciate. The largest nest hung like a grey lantern from the lowest branch, roughly the size of a whiskey barrel and home to thousands of insects whose temperament matched the desert heat, quick to anger and slow to forgive. This tree had witnessed hangings, whippings, and other demonstrations of frontier justice, but never had. It'd been asked to oversee something quite as calculating and cruel as what was about to unfold. The townspeople had chosen this spot not for its shade or beauty, but for the very danger that nested in its branches. They knew exactly what they were doing when they dragged Clara Cooper to this place, and they knew exactly what they hoped the wasps would accomplish. Clara Cooper stood 5 feet and 3 inches tall and weighed nearly 200 pounds, her body soft and rounded in ways that the narrow-minded folk of Bitter Creek found both fascinating and revolting. At 24 years old, she possessed a quick wit, gentle hands that could coax life from the most stubborn desert plants, and a voice that could calm spooked horses or charm songs from mockingbirds. But in a town where women were valued primarily for their ability to bear children and keep house without complaint, Clara's intelligence was seen as dangerous and her size as shameful. She had arrived in Bitter Creek 3 years earlier with her uncle Theodore Cooper, a traveling preacher who specialized in fire and brimstone sermons about the wages of sin. Theodore had inherited a small plot of land on the outskirts of town from a distant relative, and he'd decided to settle down and establish a proper church rather than continue his nomadic ministry. Clara had nowhere else to go after her parents died of typhoid fever in Kansas, so she'd followed her uncle into the Arizona territory with little enthusiasm and even less hope. The Cooper homestead sat a half-mile south of town, a modest adobe house surrounded by Clara's carefully tended garden. She grew vegetables that thrived in the desert climate, beans, squash, chili peppers, and tomatoes that she coaxed from the reluctant soil through patience, persistence, and an almost mystical understanding of what plants needed to flourish. Her garden was the envy of every housewife in Bitter Creek, though few would admit it publicly. Clara also kept chickens, goats, and a milk cow named Bessie, who seemed to produce cream richer than anything that came from the more conventionally managed livestock in town. Despite her uncle's stern religious convictions and the town's general hostility toward anyone who didn't fit their narrow definitions of acceptability, Clara had carved out a small space of contentment in her desert exile. She read voraciously, borrowing books from the few literate families in town and treasuring each volume like a precious gem. She wrote letters to distant relatives and friends back in Kansas, though the responses grew fewer and more formal as the years passed. Most importantly, she had learned to find joy in small things. The way morning light painted the mountains purple and gold, the sound of rain on her tin roof during the rare desert storms, the satisfaction of a perfectly risen loaf of bread cooling on her kitchen table. But Clara's contentment was built on a foundation of solitude, and solitude in a frontier town was a luxury that single women were rarely allowed to maintain indefinitely. The pressure to marry had been building steadily since her 21st birthday, and that pressure had recently taken on a particularly ugly and insistent form. Jeremiah Blackwood owned more land than any other man in 3 counties, and he had the kind of wealth that allowed him to believe his desires automatically became other people's obligations. At 42 years old, he was a widower whose first wife had died under circumstances that polite society chose not to examine too closely. He stood 6 feet tall, with the lean build of a man who did his killing with words and money rather than physical violence, though those who crossed him often found themselves wishing he'd simply used his fists instead. Blackwood had made his fortune buying up land from desperate settlers at prices that barely covered their outstanding debts, then consolidating those holdings into vast cattle ranches worked by men who had little choice but to accept whatever wages he offered. He owned the bank, controlled the town council, and maintained a network of informants who kept him apprised of every whispered conversation and private transaction in Bitter Creek. When Jeremiah Blackwood wanted something, he generally got it, and he had recently decided that he wanted Clara Cooper. His interest in Clara had nothing to do with affection or even physical attraction. Blackwood saw her as a challenge to be conquered, a puzzle to be solved through the application of sufficient pressure and manipulation. He had observed her independence with the cold calculation of a predator studying prey, noting how she managed her homestead without male supervision, how she conducted business in town without seeking anyone's permission or approval, how she moved through the world as if she had every right to occupy space and make decisions. This independence offended Blackwood's sense of natural order, and he had decided that breaking Clara Cooper would be both profitable and entertaining. The courtship, if it could be called that, had begun 6 months earlier, with Blackwood appearing at Clara's door on Sunday afternoons with flowers from his greenhouse and compliments that felt more like threats wrapped in silk. He would sit in her parlor and speak of marriage as if it were a business transaction already concluded, discussing how her property would complement his holdings and how her domestic skills would benefit his household. Clara had tried to discourage him politely at first, serving him weak coffee and stale cookies while steering the conversation toward neutral topics like weather and crop yields. But Blackwood was not a man who accepted subtle hints or gentle deflections. His visits became more frequent and more insistent, his gifts more expensive and more pointed. He brought her silk dresses that were far too small for her body, jewelry that would look ridiculous against her plain features, perfumes that smelled like the kind of woman she had no interest in becoming. Each gift came with increasingly direct suggestions about how she might change herself to become more suitable as his wife. The breaking point had come 3 weeks ago, when Blackwood arrived with a formal marriage proposal written on expensive paper and witnessed by 2 members of the town council. The document laid out the terms of their union with the cold precision of a business contract. Clara would transfer ownership of her property to her husband, cease all independent commercial activities, and submit to his guidance in matters of dress, behavior, and social interaction. In exchange, she would receive his protection, his name, and the security of knowing her place in the world. Clara had read the proposal twice, folded it carefully, and handed it back to Blackwood with words that would echo through Bitter Creek for years to come. "Mr. Blackwood," Clara had said, her voice steady as mountain stone, "I thank you for the honor of your proposal, but I must decline. I have no desire to marry you or any man who sees marriage as a means of acquiring property rather than sharing a life. I am content with my independence and have no intention of surrendering it for the privilege of serving as someone else's possession." The silence that followed her refusal stretched like a taut rope ready to snap. Blackwood's face had gone through several shades of red before settling into the pale, cold expression that his business rivals learned to fear. He had stood, slowly straightened his coat with deliberate care, and looked at Clara as if she were a mathematical problem that had suddenly become much more complicated. "Miss Cooper," he had replied, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that made grown men step out of his way on the street. "I believe you may have misunderstood the nature of this proposal. This was not a request that you are free to accept or decline according to your whims. This was an opportunity for you to align yourself with respectability and security. Your refusal suggests a concerning lack of judgment that I'm sure your uncle would be interested to discuss." Theodore Cooper, who had been sitting silently in the corner throughout the exchange, had cleared his throat nervously and suggested that perhaps Clara needed more time to consider such an important decision. But Clara had stood firm, her chin raised and her hands steady as she met Blackwood's cold stare. She had thanked him again for his interest, wished him well in finding a more suitable wife, and asked him to respect her decision. Blackwood had left without another word, but the look in his eyes had promised that this conversation was far from over. Clara had watched him ride away and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert wind. She knew enough about powerful men to understand that they rarely accepted defeat gracefully, and she had just inflicted a very public defeat on the most powerful man in Bitter Creek. The consequences had begun almost immediately. Clara found herself excluded from church socials and town gatherings, where she had previously been tolerated if not welcomed. Shopkeepers who had once extended her credit suddenly demanded cash payment for everything. Children who had played in her garden were forbidden by their parents from visiting the Cooper homestead. Even her uncle, who depended on Blackwood's financial support for his church, began suggesting that Clara reconsider her hasty decision. But the social isolation was only the beginning. Blackwood had spent 3 weeks systematically destroying Clara's ability to maintain her independence, buying up her debts, pressuring her customers to cancel their orders for vegetables and eggs, and spreading rumors about her moral character that grew more poisonous with each retelling. By the end of the month, Clara Cooper had been transformed from an eccentric but harmless spinster into a dangerous woman whose very existence threatened the natural order of things. The morning of September 15th dawned clear and hot, with the kind of merciless sun that could kill a man foolish enough to venture into the desert without adequate water. Clara had risen before dawn to tend her garden, unaware that this would be the last morning she would ever spend in the peace of her own home. She had fed her chickens, milked Bessie, and harvested the last of her summer tomatoes, moving through her familiar routines with the unconscious grace of someone who had found her place in the world. The knock on her door came at exactly 9. o'clock, delivered by Sheriff Morton Briggs and two of his deputies. Briggs was a weak man who had learned to disguise his cowardice as respect for authority, and his authority in Bitter Creek flowed directly from Jeremiah Blackwood's bank account. He stood on Clara's porch with his hat in his hands and an expression of manufactured regret on his weathered face. "Miss Cooper," he had said, his voice carrying the hollow formality of a man reading from a script, "I'm afraid I have some disturbing news. It has come to my attention that you have been engaging in activities that violate the moral standards of our community. Several respected citizens have filed complaints about your behavior, and I'm afraid I have no choice but to place you under arrest pending a hearing before the town council." Clara had stared at him in genuine confusion, her mind racing through recent events to identify what possible crime she might have committed. She paid her taxes, attended church when her uncle demanded it, and kept to herself in ways that should have made her the least troublesome resident in Bitter Creek. She had asked what specific charges were being brought against her, but Briggs had simply repeated his vague references to moral violations and community standards. The truth, of course, was that no formal charges had been filed and no hearing had been scheduled. This was Jeremiah Blackwood's justice, swift and final, designed to send a message to any other women in Bitter Creek who might be tempted to believe they had the right to make their own choices. Clara Cooper was about to become an example, a cautionary tale told in whispers, to remind everyone of what happened to those who forgot their place. They had allowed her to dress properly and gather a few personal items, but Clara noticed that the deputies had positioned themselves to prevent any attempt at escape. Not that she had anywhere to run in a territory where being alone and female was essentially a death sentence. She had walked to the sheriff's wagon with as much dignity as she could muster, her head held high even as her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. The ride to town had been brief but horrible, with curious townspeople lining the street to watch Clara Cooper's fall from grace. Some faces showed genuine sympathy, but most displayed the kind of satisfied cruelty that came from seeing someone else's misfortune confirm their own moral superiority. Children pointed and whispered, while their mothers made theatrical gestures of protecting them from corruption. Men nodded approvingly, as if witnessing the restoration of natural law. They had taken her directly to the cottonwood tree, where a crowd was already gathering in anticipation of the morning's entertainment. Someone had prepared thick ropes and positioned a wooden crate beneath the lowest branch. The wasp nest hung just above head height, its papery surface already vibrating with the activity of thousands of insects, disturbed by the unusual commotion. Below, Jeremiah Blackwood had been waiting in the shade of his carriage, dressed in his finest suit as if attending a wedding rather than an execution. He had watched Clara's arrival with the detached interest of a man observing a scientific experiment, taking note of her posture, her expression, her attempts to maintain composure in the face of calculated humiliation. When their eyes met across the dusty space between wagon and tree, Clara saw nothing in his face that resembled human emotion. Only cold satisfaction and the absolute certainty that he was about to get everything he wanted. The crowd pressed closer as Sheriff Briggs stepped forward with coils of hemp rope that had been soaked in water to make them stronger and more painful against human flesh. Clara Cooper stood beneath the massive cottonwood tree, her hands trembling despite her efforts to maintain dignity, while the wasp nest above her head pulsed with the restless energy of thousands of insects sensing disturbance. The morning heat was already beginning to build, turning the air thick and oppressive, but the real torture hadn't even begun. "Citizens of Bitter Creek," Jeremiah Blackwood announced, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd with practiced authority. We are here today to witness the consequences of defying the natural order that God and civilization have established in our community." He gestured toward Clara with the casual dismissal of a man pointing out a piece of damaged property. "This woman has rejected the protection and guidance that our society offers to those of her station, choosing instead to live in willful rebellion against the sacred institution of marriage and the wisdom of her betters." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembled townspeople, punctuated by the occasional amen from the more religiously inclined spectators. Clara noticed how many faces in the crowd belonged to women she had once considered friends, or at least friendly acquaintances. Mrs. Henderson, who had borrowed Clara's recipe for preserving peaches just last month. Sarah Mitchell, whose youngest daughter had spent countless afternoons helping Clara tend her garden. Even young Emma Caldwell, barely 16 herself, watched with the kind of fascinated horror that suggested she was learning what happened to women who forgot their place. The rope burned against Clara's wrists as Deputy Morrison wound it tight, his hands rough and deliberately careless as he secured her arms behind her back. She could smell the whiskey on his breath, could see the cruel pleasure in his eyes as he jerked the bindings tighter than necessary. This was not simply duty for these men, it was entertainment, a chance to participate in the humiliation of someone who had dared to think herself above the rules that governed everyone else. "The Wasps," Blackwood continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a preacher delivering a particularly satisfying sermon about damnation, "are God's own creatures, designed to punish those who disturb the peace of his creation. They do not discriminate based on wealth or beauty or social standing. They respond only to threat and disruption." He paused, allowing his words to sink in as he looked directly at Clara. Perhaps a few hours spent contemplating the consequences of disturbing natural harmony will restore this woman's understanding of her proper place in our community. Clara felt the rough bark of the cottonwood pressing against her back as they positioned her directly beneath the lowest branch, where the massive wasp nest hung like a grey promise of agony. The papery surface of the nest was already showing signs of increased activity, with dozens of wasps crawling across its exterior and more emerging from the entrance holes with each passing minute. She could hear the low, threatening hum that signaled their growing agitation, and she knew that it would take very little additional disturbance to trigger a full defensive response. Deputy Carr stepped forward with a longer rope, designed to secure Clara's ankles to iron stakes that had been driven deep into the hard-packed earth. The positioning was calculated with mathematical precision. She would be unable to move more than a few inches in any direction, unable to protect her face or upper body from attack, unable to run even if the ropes somehow loosened. She would be completely helpless, a living target for creatures whose only instinct when threatened was to attack with everything they had. As the final knots were tightened and tested, the crowd settled in for what they clearly expected to be an extended period of entertainment. Someone had brought wooden crates to use as makeshift seating, while others spread blankets on the ground as if preparing for a particularly macabre picnic. Children darted between the adults, their excited chatter creating an atmosphere that felt more like a county fair than an execution. "How long you reckon it'll take before she starts begging?" asked Tom Sullivan, a rancher whose own wife had died under suspicious circumstances the previous winter. His question was directed at no one in particular, but it sparked a wave of speculation and wagering that revealed just how thoroughly Clara's humanity had been stripped away in the minds of her neighbors. She had become nothing more than a curiosity, a test subject in an experiment designed to prove the consequences of female disobedience. Mrs. Abernathy, the banker's wife and self-appointed guardian of community morality, fanned herself with a piece of cardboard while offering her expert opinion on the proceedings. "I've always said that woman needed humbling," she declared, her voice carrying the satisfied certainty of someone whose predictions were finally being proven correct. walking around town like she owned the place, refusing perfectly good offers of marriage, acting like she was too good for honest Christian folk. Well, let's see how proud she feels when those wasps start taking an interest in her. Clara closed her eyes and tried to block out the voices, focusing instead on the sounds of the desert that lay beyond this circle of human cruelty. Somewhere, in the distance, a hawk cried as it rode the thermal currents above the mountains. Closer to town, she could hear the lowing of cattle being driven to water and the rhythmic sound of someone chopping wood. These were the sounds of normal life, continuing while she faced torture and possibly death, for the crime of believing she had the right to choose her own fate. The sun climbed higher, and with it came the heat that would make her ordeal even more unbearable. Clara could already feel sweat beginning to form on her forehead and under her arms, and she knew that the salt and moisture would only make her more attractive to the insects buzzing overhead. The wedding dress that she had been forced to wear was made of heavy fabric that trapped heat and restricted movement, transforming what should have been a symbol of hope and new beginnings into an instrument of additional torment. "Look there," called out young Billy Henderson, pointing excitedly at the wasp nest. "They're getting all stirred up." Indeed, the level of activity around the nest had increased dramatically, with wasps now streaming in and out of the multiple entrance holes, and beginning to explore the area around Clara's helpless form. Several had already landed on her shoulders and in her hair, their presence creating a terrible anticipation that was almost worse than actual stings would have been. Reverend Matthews, Clara's own uncle, stood at the edge of the crowd with his hands clasped behind his back and an expression of pious resignation on his weathered face. He had not spoken in her defense, had not questioned the legality or morality of what was happening, had not even acknowledged their family relationship. Instead, he watched with the detached interest of a man observing the inevitable consequences of sin, occasionally nodding as if confirming some theological principle that Clara's suffering was meant to illustrate. The first wasp to actually sting Clara landed on the side of her neck, where her pulse was visible beneath the thin skin. The pain was immediate and shocking, like being touched with a red-hot needle, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the psychological impact of knowing this was just the beginning. The wasp's attack pheromones would now mark her as a target for every other wasp in the vicinity, turning her into a magnet for their collective rage. Within minutes, more wasps had joined the attack, attracted by both the chemical signals and the increasingly frantic movement of their victim. Clara's attempts to shake them off only served to further agitate the insects, creating a feedback loop of pain and panic that was exactly what her tormentors had hoped to achieve. The crowd leaned forward with obvious anticipation, their faces showing the kind of eager cruelty that revealed just how thin the veneer of civilization really was. "She's dancing now," laughed Mayor Hutchins, a man whose political career was built entirely on his ability to anticipate and cater to the basest instincts of his constituents. "Look at her trying to get away from those little fellas. Maybe next time she'll think twice before she goes putting on airs and acting like she's better than the rest of us good Christian folk." The pain was unlike anything Clara had ever experienced, sharp and burning, and accompanied by a swelling that made each subsequent sting feel even worse. Her face was already beginning to puff up around her eyes, and angry red welts were appearing on every exposed piece of skin. But worse than the physical agony was the growing realization that this was far from over, that she was trapped here for hours of additional torture with no possibility of escape or relief. Dr. Patterson, the town's only physician, stood near, the back of the crowd, with his medical bag at his feet and his arms folded across his chest. Clara caught sight of him between the legs of the spectators and felt a desperate surge of hope that quickly died when she saw the cold indifference in his expression. He was here as an observer, not a potential rescuer, and his presence served only to add a veneer of medical legitimacy to what was essentially a lynch mob. As more wasps found their target, Clara's attempts to remain dignified began to crumble under the assault of pure biological terror. Her body convulsed involuntarily with each new sting. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, and despite her best efforts to remain silent, small cries of pain began to escape from her throat. These sounds seemed to energize the crowd even further, confirming their belief that they were witnessing the breaking of someone who had thought herself unbreakable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. By mid-morning, the Arizona sun had transformed the area around the cottonwood tree into a furnace that sapped strength from even the spectators who were free to move and seek shade. For Clara, bound immobile in her heavy dress and unable to escape either the direct sunlight or the increasingly aggressive wasps, the heat became another layer of torment added to an already unbearable situation. Sweat poured down her face, stinging the wasp wounds around her eyes and making it difficult to see clearly. The combination of heat exhaustion, dehydration, and multiple wasp stings was beginning to have serious physiological effects that went beyond mere discomfort. Clara's heart was racing as her body struggled to cope with the toxic compounds being pumped into her bloodstream with each new sting, while the heat was causing dangerous levels of fluid loss that her bound position prevented her from addressing. She was beginning to experience the kind of medical emergency that could easily prove fatal if it continued much longer. "Getting a little warm out here," observed Fred Garrison, one of the town's more prosperous merchants, as he mopped his forehead with a handkerchief. "Maybe we should move this along before she passes out and spoils the fun." His suggestion was met with murmurs of agreement from other spectators who were beginning to feel the effects of the desert heat themselves, but no one seemed willing to take the initiative to actually end Clara's ordeal. Jeremiah Blackwood checked his pocket watch with the air of a man monitoring a business appointment, his expression showing mild irritation at the slow pace of Clara's capitulation. He had clearly expected her to break much sooner, to beg for mercy and agree to marry him as the price of her release. But Clara's stubborn refusal to surrender was beginning to interfere with his carefully planned schedule, and his patience was wearing thin. "Miss Cooper," he called out, his voice cutting through the buzzing of insects and the murmur of conversation. "You need only speak the words that will end this unpleasantness. Agree to reconsider my proposal, acknowledge your error in refusing the protection and guidance I offered, and this ordeal can conclude immediately." He paused, allowing the offer to register before adding, "Your pride is not worth your life." Clara lifted her head with tremendous effort, her vision blurred by swelling and her voice hoarse from screaming, but her words carried clearly across the crowd. "I would rather die as myself than live as your property." The defiance in her tone sent a shock through the assembled townspeople who had expected complete capitulation by this point. Even Blackwood's composure cracked slightly, his face reddening with anger at this continued resistance to his will. The wasps seemed to sense the increased tension, responding with renewed aggression that brought fresh cries of pain from their victim. Clara's body was now covered with dozens of stings, her face so swollen that her features were barely recognizable, her breathing labored and irregular. It was becoming clear to even the most bloodthirsty spectators that they were witnessing something that was moving rapidly beyond punishment toward murder. What none of the townspeople noticed, focused as they were on the spectacle beneath the cottonwood tree, was the figure watching them from the ridgeline that overlooked Bitter Creek. Talon had been tracking a wounded deer through the desert when the sounds of human gathering had drawn his attention to the settlement below. As a Comanche warrior, he had learned to read the signs of white man's cruelty from a distance, and what he observed through the shimmering heat made his jaw clench with familiar anger. Talon was 28 years old, with the lean build and weathered features of someone who had spent his entire life in harmony with the harsh demands of desert survival. His people had been driven from their traditional hunting grounds by the same kind of men who were now gathered below, forced to adapt to an increasingly hostile world where their very existence was seen as an obstacle to white expansion. He had every reason to hate the pale-skinned settlers and their crude towns, every justification for simply riding away and leaving them to face the consequences of their own barbarity. But through his spyglass, fashioned from materials taken from a cavalry patrol that no longer needed them, Talon could see that the victim tied beneath the tree was not a willing participant in whatever ritual the whites were conducting. The woman's posture, her obvious distress, and the cruel satisfaction visible on the faces of her tormentors told a story that transcended racial boundaries. This was not justice or even revenge. This was the kind of calculated cruelty that his grandfather had warned him was the true nature of the white man's civilization. Talon had witnessed public executions before, had seen whites hang their criminals and shoot their enemies with the ceremonial formality that they seemed to require for their various forms of killing. But this was different, slower and more deliberately sadistic, designed to inflict maximum suffering rather than achieve any practical purpose. The woman below was not a warrior defeated in battle, or even a criminal receiving punishment for specific crimes. She was simply someone who had displeased powerful people and was now paying the price for that displeasure. The irony was not lost on him that he, a man whose people were considered savage by white standards, was perhaps the only person within 50 miles who possessed both the ability and the inclination to intervene in what was clearly an act of barbaric cruelty. His warhorse, a magnificent paint stallion named Thunderwalker, shifted restlessly beneath him as if sensing his rider's internal conflict. The animal had been trained for battle and raid, not rescue missions that would benefit the very people who had driven his people from their homes. As Talon continued to observe, the woman's condition was clearly deteriorating to a dangerous degree. Even from his distant vantage point, he could see that she was weakening rapidly under the combined assault of heat, insects, and dehydration. The crowd below seemed oblivious to the fact that their entertainment was about to become a murder, their bloodlust apparently overriding any concern for where their cruelty might ultimately lead. Thunderwalker pawed the ground and snorted, his keen animal instincts picking up on emotions that his rider was trying to suppress. The horse had carried Talon through dozens of battles and raids, had learned to read the subtle signals that indicated when his master was preparing for action. And despite every rational argument against intervention, despite the certain knowledge that helping this white woman would bring nothing but danger and complications, Talon felt the familiar tightening in his chest that always preceded a decision that would change everything. The sun was approaching its zenith, and the heat shimmers, rising from the desert floor, would soon make observation difficult. If he was going to act, it would have to be soon, before the combination of environmental factors and human cruelty succeeded in killing someone who had committed no crime other than refusing to surrender her dignity to men who had never possessed any themselves. Talon took a final look through his spyglass, memorizing the layout of the town and the positions of the people below, then began making his way down the ridge toward whatever destiny awaited him in Bitter Creek. Talon guided Thunderwalker down the treacherous slope that his ancestors had named Wind's Teeth for the way sharp rocks jutted from the mountainside like fangs waiting to tear flesh from bone. This ridge had been sacred to his people for generations before the white settlers arrived, a place where young warriors came to seek visions and old ones came to die with dignity. Now it served as his observation post for a town built on stolen land, where he watched the descendants of thieves torturing a woman whose only crime was refusing to be owned. The paint stallion moved with the fluid grace of an animal born to navigate impossible terrain, his hooves finding purchase on surfaces that would challenge a mountain goat. Talon had trained Thunderwalker from a colt, teaching him to read the subtlest shifts in weight and balance that meant the difference between life and death in combat. They moved as one being, horse and rider united by years of shared danger and mutual trust, their descent as silent as smoke drifting across morning sky. As they drew closer to the settlement, Talon could hear individual voices rising from the crowd gathered beneath the cottonwood tree. The sounds of human cruelty were the same in any language, the excited chatter of spectators watching suffering, the cruel laughter of those who found entertainment in another's pain, the weak protests of the few who possessed enough conscience to feel uncomfortable but lacked the courage to intervene. He had heard these same sounds from cavalry camps where soldiers tortured captured warriors, from trading posts where cheating white merchants celebrated their successful frauds. The woman's cries had grown weaker during his descent, and Talon could see that her condition was rapidly becoming critical. Her head lolled forward in a way that suggested approaching unconsciousness, while her body convulsed with increasing frequency as the wasp venom accumulated in her system. The crowd seemed oblivious to the fact that their entertainment was about to become a corpse, their bloodlust apparently overwhelming any capacity for recognizing when punishment had crossed the line into murder. Talon had witnessed many deaths in his 28 years of life, had dealt death himself when circumstances demanded it, but those killings had been honest affairs conducted between warriors who understood the stakes of their conflict. What he observed below was something different entirely, the systematic torture of a helpless victim by people who believed their superiority gave them the right to inflict unlimited suffering on anyone who challenged their authority. It was the kind of cruelty that his grandfather had warned him was the true face of white civilization. Thunderwalker's ears flicked backward as they approached the outer edge of town, his keen animal senses detecting the tension that radiated from the human gathering ahead. The stallion had been trained for war and could distinguish between the nervous energy of an approaching battle and the ugly excitement of a crowd gathering for entertainment. This was neither. This was something that made even a war horse uncomfortable, a wrongness that violated the natural order of things in ways that transcended species boundaries. As Talon positioned himself behind a cluster of barrel cactus that would conceal his presence while he studied the situation more closely, his mind drifted to another scene of white man's cruelty that had shaped his understanding of their true nature. 7 winters ago, soldiers from Fort Bowie had captured his younger sister, Morning Star, during a raid on their winter camp. She had been 16 years old, barely more than a child, guilty of nothing more than being born Comanche in a world where that was increasingly seen as a crime worthy of death. The soldiers had claimed she was being taken to a mission school where she would learn to become civilized, but Talon had tracked them to their fort and witnessed the reality of white man's civilization firsthand. Morning Star had been stripped of her clothes, her hair, her name, and her dignity, transformed from a proud daughter of the people into a cowering shadow who jumped at sudden sounds and spoke only in whispers. The missionaries had called it salvation. Talon had recognized it as a different form of murder, one that killed the spirit while leaving the body technically alive. He had managed to get close enough to speak with her during one of her supervised walks around the fort's compound, but the girl who looked back at him with hollow eyes was no longer his sister in any meaningful sense. The whites had succeeded in killing Morning Star as surely as if they had put a bullet through her heart, replacing her with a broken creature who spoke their language and prayed to their god and had learned to be grateful for the privilege of serving her captors. She had begged him not to try to rescue her, had wept as she explained that she no longer knew how to be Comanche. Talon had honored her wishes and left her at the fort, but the memory of her terrified face haunted him through 7 long years of war and wandering. Every time he encountered white settlers, he saw the same capacity for cruelty that had destroyed his sister, the same absolute certainty that their way of life was superior to all others, and that anyone who resisted their vision of progress deserved whatever punishment they chose to inflict. It would have been so easy to simply ride away from Bitter Creek and let these people destroy themselves in whatever manner they chose. But the woman tied beneath the tree was not a soldier or a settler or even a willing participant in the system that had stolen his people's land and murdered his family. She was a victim, as helpless in her own way as Morning Star had been, facing torture and death for the crime of refusing to surrender her identity to men who saw her as property to be acquired and controlled. The parallels were too obvious to ignore, the moral imperative too clear to dismiss. Thunderwalker snorted softly and nudged Talon's shoulder with his massive head, as if sensing his rider's internal struggle and offering encouragement. The stallion had been his companion through countless raids and battles, had carried him safely through dangers that should have killed them both, had never once failed to respond when courage was demanded. If a horse could understand the difference between right and wrong, perhaps there was hope that humans might eventually learn the same lesson. Talon reached forward and stroked Thunderwalker's neck, feeling the powerful muscles that had carried him across thousands of miles of desert and mountain terrain. They had survived this long by choosing their battles carefully, by avoiding conflicts that offered no strategic advantage, by recognizing when discretion was the better part of valor. But some battles chose you rather than the other way around, and some moral challenges could not be avoided without losing something essential about who you were. The tactical situation was as hopeless as it was morally clear-cut. Talon counted at least 40 adults in the crowd gathered around the cottonwood tree, with an unknown number of armed men among them, and certainly more weapons readily available in the town's buildings. He was a single warrior with a war lance, a cavalry saber taken from a dead soldier, and a repeating rifle with perhaps 20 rounds of ammunition. The mathematics of the situation suggested that any attempt at rescue would result in nothing more than adding his own corpse to the day's entertainment. But Talon had not survived 7 years of guerrilla warfare against overwhelming odds by accepting the mathematics that his enemies preferred. The key to successful raiding was not superior numbers or firepower, but superior speed, surprise, and the willingness to do things that your opponents considered impossible or insane. White settlers thought like white settlers, which meant they had predictable weaknesses that could be exploited by someone who thought like a Comanche warrior. The crowd's attention was completely focused on their victim, creating a kind of tunnel vision that would make them vulnerable to attack from an unexpected direction. They had positioned themselves for optimal viewing of the spectacle, not for defense against external threats, and their weapons were either holstered or left in nearby buildings. Most importantly, they had made the classic white man's mistake of assuming that their superiority in numbers made them safe from any form of retaliation. Talon studied the layout of the town with the eye of a professional raider, identifying escape routes, potential obstacles, and the location of key targets. The main street ran straight through the center of the settlement, offering a clear path for a mounted warrior who could build up sufficient speed. The buildings were spaced far enough apart to allow maneuvering, but close enough together to provide cover from return fire. Most importantly, the cottonwood tree stood at the very edge of town, meaning that a successful rescue attempt would require only a brief exposure to concentrated fire before reaching the relative safety of open desert. Thunderwalker would be the key to any successful rescue attempt. The stallion's speed and agility were legendary among the Comanche, and his training for mounted combat would allow him to navigate through a panicked crowd while his rider concentrated on the actual mechanics of cutting the woman free. But the timing would have to be absolutely perfect, with no room for hesitation or second thoughts. One moment of uncertainty, one missed cut with the knife, one stumble by the horse, and they would all die together beneath that tree. The woman's condition was deteriorating rapidly, which meant that time was running out for both rescue and survival. Even if he succeeded in freeing her from the ropes, she might be too weak from heat exhaustion and wasp stings to hold on during the escape. He would have to carry her dead weight, while controlling his horse with one hand and defending against pursuit with the other, all while navigating terrain that was treacherous enough when he had both hands free and no distractions. As Talon made his final preparations, checking weapons and adjusting Thunderwalker's war bridle for maximum responsiveness, he caught sight of the woman raising her head one last time. Even from his concealed position, he could see that her face was so swollen from wasp stings that her features were barely recognizable as human. But there was something in her posture, some quality of unbroken defiance that reminded him powerfully of Morning Star before the whites had crushed her spirit. The crowd was growing restless, their initial enthusiasm beginning to fade as the heat and the slowness of their victim's collapse made the entertainment less immediately satisfying. Several people were already beginning to drift away, seeking shade or refreshment, while others called for more direct action to speed up the proceedings. It was clear that the situation would soon escalate beyond mere torture to outright execution, with or without the Wasp's assistance. "She's taking too damn long to break," complained someone in the crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the desert air. "Maybe we should help those wasps along with a few rocks or a whip." The suggestion was met with murmurs of agreement from several other spectators, confirming Talon's assessment that time was indeed running out. Whatever he was going to do, it had to happen now, before the crowd's impatience turned to direct violence. Talon closed his eyes for a moment and spoke a brief prayer in the language of his people, asking his ancestors for strength and guidance. In the battle ahead, he had learned long ago that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite fear, to choose what was right even when what was right might get you killed. The spirits of his grandfather and his lost sister seemed to whisper encouragement on the desert wind, reminding him that some things were worth dying for. Thunderwalker seemed to sense that the moment of action had arrived, his muscles bunching with anticipation as his rider gathered the reins and prepared to emerge from concealment. The stallion's ears were pricked forward, his nostrils flaring as he tested the wind for the sense of battle, his entire being focused on the challenge ahead. They had done this dance of death many times before, horse and rider united in purpose, and perfectly attuned to each other's movements. The woman beneath the tree suddenly convulsed more violently than before, her back arching as another wave of wasp stings found their mark. The sound that escaped her throat was barely human, more animal than conscious expression, and it seemed to galvanize the crowd into renewed enthusiasm for her suffering. Several men began calling out suggestions for additional torments, while the women in the group leaned forward with the eager anticipation of spectators at a particularly exciting horse race. Talon touched his heels to Thunderwalker's flanks, and the great stallion exploded from concealment like a lightning bolt. Given physical form, his hooves striking sparks from the rocky ground as he built speed with each powerful stride. The war cry that erupted from Talon's throat was the same one his ancestors had used to strike terror into the hearts of their enemies for generations. A sound that seemed to come from the earth itself and promised death to anyone who stood in its path. The crowd's reaction was exactly what Talon had anticipated, complete panic and confusion, as people who had been focused entirely on their victim suddenly found themselves under attack from a direction they had never considered. Men dove for cover behind whatever obstacles they could find, women screamed and scattered in all directions, and children ran blindly through the chaos without any clear destination in mind. The careful organization of their torture session dissolved into complete pandemonium in the space of a few heartbeats. Thunderwalker's training for mounted combat became evident as he navigated through the panicking crowd without breaking stride, his movements fluid and precise despite the obstacles and confusion. Talon leaned low over his mount's neck, presenting a smaller target, while keeping his hands free for the knife work that would be necessary to cut the woman's bonds. The few men who managed to draw weapons found themselves unable to get a clear shot without risking their own people, while those who tried to stand their ground discovered that a war horse in full charge was an irresistible force. The cottonwood tree rushed toward them with terrifying speed, and Talon could see the woman's face clearly for the first time. She was younger than he had expected, probably no more than 25, with features that might have been pretty before the wasp stings transformed them into something grotesque. But her eyes were still alert, still defiant, and when she saw him approaching, she seemed to understand instinctively that rescue was at hand rather than additional torment. Talon's knife was in his hand before Thunderwalker reached the tree, the blade singing as it sliced through air that seemed thick as honey in the slowed time perception that always accompanied moments of extreme danger. The first rope parted with a sound like a guitar string snapping, followed immediately by the second, and then he was reaching down to grab the woman's arm as Thunderwalker wheeled in a tight circle that would take them back toward open desert. That woman was heavier than expected and weaker than hoped, her body a dead weight that threatened to drag them both from the saddle as Talon struggled to pull her up behind him. For a terrifying moment, it seemed as though the rescue might fail at the very moment of success. But then her survival instincts kicked in, and she managed to throw one arm around his waist while he hauled her upward with main strength. Behind them, the crowd was beginning to recover from their initial shock and organize some form of pursuit. Men were running toward buildings where rifles were stored, horses were being hastily saddled, and angry voices were calling for immediate retaliation against the savage who had dared to interfere with white man's justice. But Talon had achieved what he needed most: surprise, confusion, and a head start that might be just enough to reach safety in the trackless desert where Thunderwalker's superiority would become decisive. The woman's weight against his back was both reassuring and terrifying, proof that the rescue had succeeded, but also a constant reminder of how much more difficult the escape would be. She was conscious but barely responsive, her grip on his belt weak and uncertain, her breathing shallow and irregular in ways that suggested serious medical problems from her ordeal. They had saved her from immediate death, but whether she would survive long enough to reach safety remained an open question. Thunderwalker's hooves drummed a staccato rhythm against the hard-pan desert floor as they raced away from bitter Greek, each stride carrying them further from the chaos behind and deeper into the unforgiving wilderness that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The stallion's breathing was controlled despite their breakneck pace, his powerful lungs working like bellows as he settled into the ground-eating gallop that had made Comanche horses legendary among both enemies and allies. Clara's weight pressed against Talon's back, her arms wrapped around his waist in a death grip that was the only thing keeping her from sliding off the racing horse. The sound of pursuit was already building behind them as the men of Bitter Creek recovered from their initial shock and began organizing a proper chase. Horses were being saddled with desperate haste while rifles were loaded and water bottles filled for what everyone knew would be a long hunt through hostile terrain. The humiliation of having their entertainment interrupted by a lone Indian warrior had transformed their cruel amusement into murderous rage, and every man in town was now personally invested in recapturing their escaped victim and making an example of her rescuer. Clara's condition was worse than Talon had initially realized. Her body racked with fever from the multiple wasp stings, and her breathing shallow and irregular in ways that suggested serious allergic reactions to the venom. Every few minutes she would convulse violently, her grip on his belt loosening dangerously, before she managed to regain enough consciousness to hold on. The heat radiating from her skin told him that infection was already setting in, and without proper medical treatment, she might not survive even if they successfully evaded capture. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The desert landscape that surrounded them was both ally and enemy, offering concealment and escape routes for those who knew how to read its subtle signs, while promising death to anyone foolish enough to challenge its harsh demands without proper preparation. Talon had been born to this land, had learned its moods and seasons from his grandfather, could find water and shelter in places where white men would see only empty wasteland. But Clara was a creature of gardens and houses, completely unprepared for the brutal realities of survival in country that killed the unprepared without mercy or hesitation. Thunderwalker's ears swiveled constantly as they rode, monitoring the sounds behind them, while also listening for the subtle audio cues that might indicate water or shelter ahead. The stallion's desert-bred instincts were as finely tuned as his riders, and his ability to detect danger or opportunity often meant the difference between life and death in country where a single mistake could prove fatal. His pace never faltered, despite the double burden he carried, his conditioning and heart proving equal to demands that would have broken lesser horses. Behind them, a dust cloud was beginning to rise as the pursuit got organized and began following their trail. Talon counted at least 8 riders in the first group, with more likely to follow as additional horses were saddled and more volunteers joined the hunt. The odds were becoming increasingly desperate with each passing minute, but desperation was an old friend to any Comanche warrior who had survived the systematic destruction of his people's way of life. Talon guided Thunderwalker toward a series of red sandstone formations that rose from the desert floor like ancient temples, built by gods who understood the true meaning of permanence. These rock formations had been sacred to his people for generations before the whites arrived, containing hidden springs and cave systems that could provide both water and shelter for those who knew their secrets. More importantly, the maze-like passages and blind canyons would allow a single warrior to hold off larger numbers while also providing multiple escape routes if the situation became untenable. As they approached the canyon entrance, Clara stirred against his back and spoke. For the first time since the rescue, her voice barely audible over the wind and thunder of hoofbeats. "Where are you taking me?" she managed to whisper, the words slurred but coherent enough to indicate that her mind was still functioning despite her physical distress. Her question carried no fear or accusation, only the practical curiosity of someone who understood that her life now depended entirely on the intentions of a man she had never seen before. "To safety," Talon replied without turning around, his attention focused on navigating the narrow entrance to the canyon system that had sheltered his ancestors during times of war and persecution. "Your people will follow, but this place has protected the innocent for longer than their grandfathers have been alive." His English was accented but clear, learned from traders and missionaries during the brief periods when his band had attempted to negotiate rather than fight with the encroaching white settlement. The canyon walls rose on either side of them, like the ramparts of some massive fortress, their surfaces carved by centuries of wind and water into fantastic shapes that seemed to shift and change as shadows moved across their surfaces. Hidden among these natural sculptures were pictographs left by previous generations of his people, telling stories of hunts and battles and spiritual visions that connected the present moment to an unbroken chain of traditions stretching back to the beginning of time. Thunderwalker's hooves echoed differently as they moved deeper into the canyon, the sound bouncing off stone walls in ways that could confuse pursuers and mask their exact location. The stallion seemed to sense the spiritual significance of this place, his movements becoming more careful and deliberate, as if he understood that they had entered ground that demanded respect. Even in his exhausted and pain-racked state, Clara appeared to feel something of the canyon's sacred atmosphere, her breathing becoming slightly more regular as they moved away from the harsh glare of open desert. The first hidden spring appeared exactly where Talon's grandfather had taught him it would be, a modest seepage of water from a crack in the rock face that had sustained his people during their darkest hours of persecution. The water was cool and sweet, filtered through layers of sandstone and limestone that removed impurities while adding minerals essential for desert survival. More importantly, the spring was completely invisible from the canyon entrance, meaning that pursuing whites would have to venture deep into unfamiliar territory to locate their quarry. Talon eased Clara down from Thunderwalker's back with the gentle care of someone accustomed to treating wounded comrades, supporting her weight while her legs remembered how to function independently. She was weaker than he had hoped, but stronger than he had feared, managing to stand with assistance while he led the stallion to the spring for a well-deserved drink. The horse's loyalty and endurance had once again proven equal to impossible demands, and Talon took a moment to stroke the great animal's neck in wordless gratitude. Clara's appearance in daylight was even more shocking than it had been from a distance, her face so swollen from wasp stings that her eyes were nearly closed and her features distorted beyond easy recognition. Angry red welts covered every exposed inch of skin, while her heavy wedding dress was torn and stained with sweat, dirt, and small amounts of blood from where the insect's stings had been particularly vicious. She looked like a survivor of some terrible battle, which in many ways was exactly what she was. "I need to treat your stings before the poison spreads further," Talon said as he helped her sit beside the spring, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to battlefield medicine. "My people have remedies for such things, plants that grow in places like this." He gestured toward the canyon walls where desert sage and other medicinal plants grew in the shade provided by overhanging rock formations. "It will hurt, but it will draw out the venom and reduce the swelling." Clara nodded weakly, lacking the strength to do anything but trust in the competence of the man who had already saved her life once today. She watched through swollen eyes as Talon quickly gathered plants that she didn't recognize, his movements efficient and purposeful as he selected specific leaves and roots that his traditional training had taught him to identify. There was something almost ritualistic about the way he worked, as if the preparation of medicine was a sacred act that connected him to generations of healers who had practiced their craft in this very place. The sound of distant voices echoed through the canyon as their pursuers finally reached the entrance and began the dangerous process of tracking quarry through unfamiliar terrain. Talon's expression tightened as he calculated distances and timing, knowing that their lead was shrinking with each passing minute, but also understanding that hasty movement now could prove more dangerous than careful preparation. Clara needed immediate medical attention, and Thunderwalker needed rest and water if he was going to carry them through whatever challenges lay ahead. "They're coming," Clara whispered, her voice carrying more resignation than fear. She had already accepted that death was a likely outcome of her defiance, and being killed, while free, seemed preferable to being dragged back to Bitter Creek for whatever additional torments Jeremiah Blackwood might devise. "You should leave me here and save yourself. You've done more than anyone had a right to expect." Talon's response was immediate and decisive. "Comanche warriors do not abandon those under their protection." He began crushing the medicinal plants between two stones, creating a paste that would draw venom from wounds while also providing some relief from pain and swelling. "Your courage under torture earned you the right to live free or die fighting. We will do both together if necessary." The application of the medicinal paste was an ordeal that tested Clara's already strained endurance, each touch against inflamed skin bringing fresh waves of pain that made her bite down on a strip of leather Talon provided to muffle her cries. But within minutes of the treatment, she could feel the burning sensation beginning to subside as the traditional remedies began counteracting the wasp venom that had been accumulating in her system. The relief was so immediate and dramatic that tears of gratitude ran down her swollen cheeks. "Your grandfather taught you this?" Clara asked between applications of the healing paste, her curiosity about her rescuer beginning to overcome her physical distress. She had never been this close to a Comanche warrior before, had heard only the frightening stories that white settlers told about savage raiders who tortured their victims and scalped the dead. The reality was completely different from the mythology, and she found herself fascinated by the contradiction between reputation and behavior. "My grandfather was a medicine man as well as a war chief," Talon replied as he continued his careful work, his hands gentle despite their obvious strength and the calluses that spoke of a lifetime spent handling weapons and war horses. "He taught me that healing and fighting are two sides of the same warrior's duty. We fight to protect those who cannot protect themselves, and we heal those who have been wounded by the cruelty of others." The voices of their pursuers were getting closer, and Talon could distinguish individual speakers among the group of men who were systematically searching the canyon for signs of their passage. He recognized the voice of Sheriff Briggs calling out threats and promises of reward money, while other voices belonged to men whose names he didn't know, but whose intentions were unmistakably hostile. They were being methodical about their search, checking every side passage and potential hiding place with the thoroughness of experienced hunters. Clara's condition was improving rapidly under the influence of the traditional medicine, the swelling around her eyes beginning to subside enough for her to see clearly for the first time in hours. The relief in her expression was profound as she realized that she was not going to die from the wasp stings that had seemed certain to kill her just a short time earlier, but her gratitude was tempered by the growing realization that they were far from safe, trapped in a canyon with limited escape routes while determined enemies closed in from the entrance. "Can we get out of here without fighting?" Clara asked, her voice stronger now but still marked by exhaustion and lingering pain. She was a practical woman who understood that her presence made any confrontation more dangerous for both of them, and she was prepared to accept whatever sacrifices might be necessary to ensure that her rescuer's heroism didn't result in his death. "I don't want you to die because of my stubborn refusal to marry a man I despise." Talon paused in his work and looked directly into her eyes, his expression serious but not without warmth. "Your refusal to surrender your dignity is not stubbornness. It is the kind of courage that my people respect above all other virtues. We will escape this place together, and you will live to make your own choices in freedom." While Clara rested beside the spring and allowed the medicine to continue its healing work, Talon began making preparations for the battle that seemed increasingly inevitable. He checked his weapons with the methodical care of a professional warrior. His rifle was loaded with 20 rounds of ammunition. His cavalry saber was sharp and properly balanced. His war lance was equipped with a steel a point that could punch through leather armor or wooden shields. More importantly, he surveyed the terrain with an eye toward tactical advantages that might allow one man to hold off several attackers. The canyon provided numerous defensive positions where a skilled fighter could control access routes while also maintaining options for withdrawal if the situation became untenable. Natural rock formations created choke points where superior numbers would be less decisive, while the echoing acoustics would make it difficult for attackers to pinpoint his exact location during any fighting. Most importantly, his intimate knowledge of the canyon system gave him options that his enemies couldn't anticipate or counter. Thunderwalker had recovered from their desperate flight and was now alertly watching the canyon entrance, his ears pricked forward and his nostrils flaring as he tested the wind for the sense of approaching horses and hostile humans. The stallion's battlefield experience made him as valuable as another warrior in situations like this, and his ability to fight alongside his rider had saved Talon's life more times than he could count. The horse would attack on command, strike with his hooves, and bite with teeth that could crush bones. Clara watched these preparations with a mixture of fascination and growing dread, understanding that she was about to witness the kind of violence that her sheltered life had never prepared her to see. But she also recognized that this violence was being undertaken on her behalf by a man who owed her nothing and had every reason to hate people of her race. The moral complexity of the situation was almost overwhelming. She was being protected by someone her own people would call a savage from men her community considered pillars of respectability. "How many are there?" she asked as the voices grew closer and it became clear that confrontation was now unavoidable. Her question was practical rather than fearful, the inquiry of someone who understood that knowledge might be the difference between life and death. She had demonstrated her own form of courage during the ordeal under the cottonwood tree, and she was prepared to face whatever additional challenges lay ahead with the same stubborn dignity. Talon's count was precise and discouraging. 8 riders, possibly more following behind, all armed, all angry, all convinced that capturing us will somehow restore their wounded pride. He completed his final weapon check and moved to a position that would give him the best field of fire when the attackers finally located their hiding place. They will offer surrender terms that they have no intention of honoring. When the shooting starts, stay low and be ready to move quickly. The first of their pursuers appeared at the bend in the canyon, moving cautiously but with obvious determination. Sheriff Briggs was in the lead, his badge glinting in the filtered sunlight as he gestured for the other men to spread out and cover potential escape routes. Behind him came the faces of men Clara recognized from Bitter Creek, shopkeepers and ranchers and church deacons who had transformed themselves into a lynch mob in pursuit of what they saw as justice for their interrupted entertainment. The first light of dawn painted the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson, transforming the sacred space where Clara and Talon had spent the night into a cathedral of natural beauty that seemed to bless their unlikely alliance. They had talked through much of the darkness, sharing stories of their different worlds, while discovering the universal human experiences that connected them across cultural boundaries that had seemed insurmountable just 24 hours earlier. Clara learned of Talon's childhood among the Comanche, his training as a warrior, and the tragic loss of his sister to white man's civilization, while he heard her tales of life in a frontier town where intelligence in women was considered dangerous, and independence was seen as a threat to natural order. As they prepared to leave the canyon sanctuary that had sheltered them through their ordeal, both understood that they were not simply continuing a journey begun in desperation, but embarking on something entirely new. Clara could never return to the life she had known in Bitter Creek, where her defiance of Jeremiah Blackwood had marked her as irredeemably corrupted in the eyes of respectable society. Talon's intervention on behalf of a white woman would make him suspect among many of his own people, who had learned through bitter experience that any cooperation with whites usually resulted in betrayal and suffering for the Comanche. But the bond forged between them during their shared trial had created possibilities that neither had imagined when they first met beneath the cottonwood tree. Clara had discovered reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed, while Talon had learned that his concept of honor could expand beyond tribal boundaries to encompass universal principles of human dignity. They were no longer simply a white woman fleeing forced marriage and a Comanche warrior following traditional codes of protection, but two individuals who had chosen to build something new from the wreckage of their previous lives. Thunder. Walker seemed to sense the significance of this new beginning as he carried them out of the canyon and into the vast desert that stretched endlessly toward horizons where anything might be possible. The stallion's gait was confident and purposeful, no longer the desperate flight of the previous day, but the measured pace of travelers who knew their destination, even if they couldn't yet see it clearly. Clara rode behind Talon with a comfort and trust that would have been unimaginable when he first pulled her from beneath the wasp nest. Her arms around his waist, expressing a partnership that transcended the simple relationship between rescuer and rescued. Their first stop was a remote trading post operated by Miguel Santos, a Mexican merchant who had learned to survive on the frontier by maintaining strict neutrality in the conflicts between whites, Indians, and his own people. Santos had built his business on the principle that commerce could bridge cultural divides when politics and prejudice failed, and his adobe compound served as a meeting place where traditional enemies could conduct business under the protection of mutually agreed-upon rules of conduct. When Talon and Clara arrived at his gates, Santos took one look at their unlikely partnership and understood immediately that he was witnessing something unprecedented. "My friends," Santos said in accented English as he welcomed them into his compound, his weathered face creasing into a smile that suggested genuine pleasure at their arrival. "It is not often that I see a Comanche warrior traveling with a white lady, especially one who looks as if she has recently survived a considerable ordeal. You are both welcome here, and your horses will be cared for while you rest and recover from whatever adventures have brought you to my door." Santos's trading post was a sanctuary of a different sort than the sacred canyon, a place where the normal rules of frontier society were suspended in favor of practical considerations that allowed people of different backgrounds to coexist peacefully. Clara marveled at the diversity of customers who came and went throughout their stay. Mexican vaqueros trading silver for ammunition, Comanche warriors exchanging buffalo hides for steel knife blades, white settlers purchasing supplies with gold dust panned from mountain streams. Here, at least, people were judged by their ability to pay, rather than the color of their skin or their adherence to particular cultural norms. During their time at the trading post, Clara and Talon began making concrete plans for their future, together discussing practical matters like where they might settle and how they would support themselves in a world that would view their partnership with suspicion, if not outright hostility. Santos proved to be a valuable advisor in these discussions, his extensive knowledge of frontier conditions helping them identify regions where their unconventional alliance might be accepted or at least tolerated by local communities. There are places, Santos told them as they sat around his kitchen table sharing a meal of beans, tortillas, and roasted goat meat, where people are too busy surviving to worry much about who you were before you arrived. California is changing rapidly. With the gold rush, and new communities are forming where traditional prejudices carry less weight than they do in established towns. Arizona territory has valleys where a man and woman can homestead without interference from neighbors, assuming they can handle the challenges of desert farming and occasional Apache raids. Before leaving the trading post, Clara made a decision that surprised even herself by asking Santos for writing materials so she could compose letters to the people she was leaving behind in Bitter Creek. She spent an entire afternoon crafting messages that attempted to explain her choices without condemning those who couldn't understand them. A delicate balance that reflected her growing maturity and wisdom gained through suffering. Her letter to Uncle Theodore was perhaps the most difficult to write, acknowledging his role in her upbringing while gently but firmly rejecting the religious justifications he had offered for her persecution. "Dear Uncle," she wrote, "I cannot claim that my choices have been guided by the same faith that shapes your life, but I have learned something about the difference between godly submission to divine will and cowardly surrender to human cruelty. The man who saved me from torture demonstrated more Christian charity than any of those who participated in my punishment, despite being raised in what you would call heathen beliefs. Perhaps true religion is measured by actions rather than ancestry." Her letter to the women of Bitter Creek was more direct, addressing the female relatives and acquaintances who had watched her torture with expressions ranging from satisfaction to uncomfortable silence. "To my former neighbors," she wrote, "I hope that none of you ever face the choice between dignity and safety, between self-determination and social acceptance. But if you do, I pray you will remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act according to your principles, even when the cost seems unbearable. The freedom to choose your own fate is worth whatever price others demand you pay for it." Most surprisingly, Clara wrote a brief note to Jeremiah Blackwood himself, not seeking forgiveness or understanding, but simply stating the truth as she had come to understand it. "Mr. Blackwood," her letter began, "you sought to own me because you confused possession with affection, control with care. I hope someday you will learn that love freely given is worth more than obedience extracted through force, and that a woman who chooses to stay is more valuable than one who has no choice but to submit. My refusal was not an insult to your character, but an assertion of my own." Talon watched Clara write these letters with growing admiration for her ability to maintain compassion even toward those who had wronged her, recognizing in her generous spirit a strength that complemented his own warrior's code of honor. He too composed a message, though his was directed toward his band's war chief and written in the pictographic symbols that his people used for important communications. 6 months later, Clara and Talon had established a homestead in a remote valley of the Arizona Territory, where desert springs provided water for irrigation and natural rock formations offered protection from both weather and potential enemies. Their adobe house was modest but comfortable, incorporating architectural elements from both Mexican and Comanche traditions to create something uniquely their own. Clara's garden flourished in soil that had never known the plow, producing vegetables that fed not only their own table but also provided trade goods for the occasional travelers who discovered their hidden valley. Their partnership had evolved into something deeper than mutual dependence or shared adversity, though both had been essential elements in its formation. They had learned to communicate across cultural boundaries through patience, humor, and the kind of intimate understanding that develops between people who have saved each other's lives and chosen to build a future together. Clara had acquired skills in desert survival, horse handling, and basic medical treatment that would have seemed impossible during her sheltered life in Bitter Creek, while Talon had discovered the satisfactions of agriculture, the pleasure of books and writing, and the complex joys of domestic life shared with an intellectual equal. Their home became a sanctuary for others who didn't fit neatly into conventional categories. Runaway slaves seeking freedom in Mexican territory, white women fleeing abusive marriages, young Comanche warriors questioning their tribe's endless cycles of raid and revenge, Mexican families displaced by American expansion. Clara and Talon offered what they could to these fellow outcasts: temporary shelter, practical advice, and the example of two people who had successfully created something new from the fragments of their broken past. The news that occasionally reached them from Bitter Creek suggested that their dramatic escape had left lasting changes in the community they had fled. Jeremiah Blackwood's reputation never recovered from the revelation that his marriage proposal had been rejected so decisively that the intended bride chose torture over acceptance, and he eventually left the territory for business opportunities in California that promised greater anonymity. Sheriff Briggs lost his badge after the details of the Canyon battle became public knowledge, replaced by a more competent lawman who understood that effective policing required community respect rather than community fear. As the sun set over their valley on the anniversary of Clara's rescue from the wasp nest, she and Talon sat on their porch, watching Thunderwalker graze in the pasture they had cleared together from virgin desert. The stallion was no longer alone, having been joined by a mare Clara had gentled and trained, their foal representing the next generation of horses born into freedom rather than servitude. The sight seemed symbolic of everything they had accomplished, taking what the world had tried to destroy and nurturing it into something beautiful and strong. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked as they watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky, her question encompassing all the choices that had brought them to this place of peace and contentment. Leaving your people, changing everything you knew about how life should be lived. Talon's response came without hesitation, carrying the certainty of a man who had found his true purpose. "I regret only that it took so long for me to understand that courage serves no purpose unless it protects those who cannot protect themselves. My grandfather taught me to be a warrior, but you taught me why warriors exist." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, but neither felt alarm as they recognized the easy pace of travelers rather than the urgent rhythm of pursuers. A Mexican family appeared in their doorway, seeking shelter for the night, their wagon loaded with possessions that suggested another group of refugees fleeing from circumstances beyond their control. Clara rose to prepare food and bedding, while Talon saw to their horses, both responding with the automatic hospitality of people who understood what it meant to need sanctuary. As they helped their unexpected guests settle in for the night, Clara reflected on how completely her definition of home had changed, from a place where she was tolerated despite her differences to a place where differences were welcomed as sources of strength and wisdom. The wasp nest that had nearly killed her had instead delivered her into a life richer and more meaningful than anything she could have imagined during her constrained existence in Bitter Creek. Sometimes the most terrible ordeals became doorways to unexpected blessings, and the courage to walk through those doorways determined whether suffering led to wisdom or merely to bitterness. The desert wind whispered through their valley that night, carrying the sounds of contentment rather than the cries of pain that had marked the beginning of their story. In the distance, coyotes sang their ancient songs while closer to home. The gentle sounds of horses breathing and humans sleeping peacefully created a symphony of security that both Clara and Talon had thought lost forever. They had built more than a home in their hidden valley. They had created proof that human beings could choose love over hatred, cooperation over domination, and hope over despair, even in a world that often seemed determined to reward only the cruel and the strong. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.